Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. And we've got a really fascinating episode today from Erika. Erika, welcome to the show. Really looking forward to getting into this with you. But thanks for making time to come
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Can you introduce yourself to the listeners, please, Erika?
I can. My name is Erika Schmitt. I am Director of Adoption and Permanency Services at an agency called the Children's Home of Pittsburgh and Lemieux Family Center. And with that, I oversee the adoption services for both a domestic infant adoption program and adoption from foster care, as well as some counseling services that we provide.
Right. So you really know your onions. And when we talked last time, you came up with this topic of the impact of infertility, which is an area that I know very little of, and I'm fascinated to hear more, especially how that plays out and can play out if we don't address it. So why did you pick that?
It's a topic I've become really interested in lately. A few years back, the Children's Home started offering infertility counseling to families that were considering adoption, as well as families that were not. And it sort of opened my eyes to all the impact that infertility has lifelong for a couple, as well as for a child that they bring into their family. And since then, I've, on top of doing infertility counseling and running support groups, I've done some research on the matter, and I just find it to be a very interesting topic that really has a big impact on a child's life in a family when a family has gone through the grief and the trauma that comes with experiencing infertility.
Yeah. So perhaps we can start with what those impacts are on the mum and the dad, or the mum and the mum, I guess sometimes,
Yes, absolutely.
Because obviously things are changing very quickly since I'm an old stick in the mud at 54, So if we can start on looking at what those impacts are on the mum, and then maybe look at how those kind of may play out later on with the kids. So what sort of things do you see here?
Yeah, so it's interesting because, when you look at couples that experience infertility, I always used to look at it as they have tons of grief and loss that go along with their journey. But a lot of researchers also say that that's trauma that they experienced. And, in order to successfully adopt, they need to work through that grief and loss, or that trauma, however you conceptualize it. But if you look at it, couples that go through infertility, they've got, 12 months of trying to have a child and really wanting to have a child before they're even officially diagnosed. And then they wait more to see a reproductive endocrinologist, and then they get tests done, and then they decide on usually doing infertility treatment in a medical way before they ever get to the thought of adoption. And then they have all these failed attempts that don't work, potential pregnancy losses, learning that they aren't pregnant on a very regular basis. And all that comes before they decide on adoption for many couples.
Yeah. So, I mean, I have a personal stake in this because that's how, that's why I was adopted, because of infertility issues. My mum and dad had done some fostering as first, I think. And so they fostered before I came along. But yeah, they came out from infertility. Obviously, the options and the treatments and all this sort of different, the things that you're talking about here just weren't around in the 60s. Right. So that kind of may have, as you talk about as you talk about this, what I'm hearing is this takes a long time, and so you've got a longer period of uncertainty. Maybe you've got kind of more highs and lows. You've got more milestones along that journey. you've got more uncertainty about all the different options that you've got. You've like, so in probably in my mum's case, and was in the 60s, it was like, no, right, adoption's your only option. So it's kind of more clear cut. Well, what you're talking about now is you've probably got different opinions. You've got longer to mull over it. You've got longer to stew over it. I don't know. Is this making any sense? I don't know.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a really long journey. And then at each step along the way, the couple just, they at first just really want to be pregnant. They really want to have a baby. And a lot of times that's connected to having a biological baby. That's what they want initially before adoption even enters their mind. So I think one of the things that has to happen, like looking ahead, is they're going through all this, they have to sort of make a switch mentally from, I want to be pregnant, I want to have a biological child, to, okay, I just want to be a parent, and I'm going to be a parent through adoption. And there's a lot that happens before that switch can be made, for the infertility process and mentally for the couple or individual.
Yeah. So is this like an emotional roller coaster? It seems like one.
Definitely is. It's got tons of ups and downs, and they get hopeful and excited, and then they find out it isn't working, and they're in this waiting game. And that's a lot of what we work through in our support groups, is the fact that it is a huge roller coaster.
Yeah. And how does that play out? How does that roller coaster? Obviously, it's going to be different for every prospective mum or mum. We call them mums here. You know that in this.
Yes.
Mums and moms. Yeah. 57% of my listeners are, 57% of our listeners are from the US. So I know there's more of you, and I know there's more agencies. Anyway, so this plays out. This roller coaster, this emotional roller coaster plays out, and you talked about grief and loss and trauma. And you said, I think you said the word, it depends how you conceptualize it, So what's the difference? But what's the difference between conceptualizing it as grief and loss, and what's the difference as conceptualizing it as trauma? Does it make a difference? Is this important?
No, I think it really depends on who you're talking to. I think that trauma is looked at as even kind of a bigger impact on someone's life than just grief and loss is big too. But I think when you look at trauma and you look at, we have a lot of our culture around adoption, and especially working with foster kids, is what we call trauma-informed care. So it's sort of a whole step up of, looking at the trauma that a person's been through and how that impacts who they are. And, they have triggers resulting from that trauma. And I believe that you obviously look at a foster child for the trauma they've experienced. A foster child that's adopted has had very clear-cut trauma, abuse, neglect. An adoptive parent that's gone through infertility can be looked at as having trauma as well. And if you look at it from that lens, there's a little more of a model of, okay, we have to, use trauma-informed care and ensure that that couple kind of works through that trauma in a healthy way before they adopt for the most successful outcome. Grief and loss is very similar. It just doesn't have the same exact impact, I guess is the word. Trauma is like a hot button word a bit now in our field.
Well, I mean, I've got a concern about trauma, the fact that we seem to be trauma obsessed. We seem to be becoming trauma obsessed. And I was having a discussion about, so I was talking to Robbie Seal who's been on the podcast. She's an adoptive mum foster adoptive mum with kids with FASD, and I said to them, right, so this is, she talks about the trauma that these kids have been through, and the trauma in utero and the FASD and all that, and I said, are there ever moments of peace, right? Because my view of trauma is it's like it's 24/7, or it's 18/7, if the kids are asleep for 6 hours, or if the birth parent is asleep for 6, it's like it's there, it's ever present. She said, no, there are moments of peace. And I just thought, well, shouldn't we be focusing on that, the peace bit? We seem to be becoming a bit trauma obsessed. So I talk about being trauma informed
Yes,
hope obsessed, because
I like that.
yeah, because I know what it's feel like. I've been down the rabbit hole of trauma, um, with some kind of relinquishment stuff, when I was about 40, and it got dark. It got dark, but I didn't go too far down the rabbit hole, and I turned around and I kind of like saw hope. I saw light at the other end of it. But I just get a feeling that there's kind of lots of trauma dumping and trauma pulling people down. Do you see what I mean? So instead of, in some of these Facebook groups, people say, I've got this problem, is this normal? And then everybody else jumps in. Yes, it's normal. I'm suffering from the same thing. And instead of actually moving people forward, we validate them in such a way that kind of drags them down. So, I mean, what do you make of all that? This is just, I'm clearly not a therapist, but that's just like a layman's view of it.
No, I think you make a really good point, Simon. I think that the goal for anyone that's experienced trauma is to make things less about the trauma and more about what you called the hope, right? So you go through enough treatment or therapy or whatever that is of self-work to process the therapy, to process the trauma, so that you have less days and less all-encompassing moments of trauma and more days of hope. And that's what you want. If you don't get to that hope point and you stay stuck in that trauma and it is all-encompassing, that's where we talk about harder outcomes for everybody, right? It's harder to succeed and to do well and to be healthy if you've not worked through the darker pieces of the trauma to get to those moments of hope. That's how I look at it.
Okay, yeah. The separation that pops into my head, or the distinction that pops into my head, I'd like to run past you. And again, this is just me being a layman view on this, albeit somebody that's talked to a lot of people in this thing. So that grief is something that eases over time. So you think of the loss of somebody, then it eases over time, whereas trauma doesn't seem, I think it's presented to me as something that doesn't ease naturally. Do you see what I mean? Like, so the grief lessens over time. So it's a downward curve. It is getting on its own,
Yes.
Whereas trauma, it sounds like to me something that's going to be there. It's going to be there. It's like I talk about playing Murder in the Dark. We used to play this game as kids, Murder in the Dark. It's you don't actually murder anybody. You just tap them on the shoulder or whatever. But it's like it's always going to be there. The trauma's always going to be there. It's just waiting to leap out on you. And that was kind of my metaphor for that. So that is where would you see the difference between? Would you see such a distinction between grief and loss lumped together and trauma super differently, or am I overcooking this? Because I sometimes overthink stuff, right?
No, I mean, I think that there is a distinction, and I think it's hard to define because I think that different people in the field use different terminology. But I think the way I look at it is that, trauma, grief and loss can happen to like common things, like someone's death. That can be traumatic, but it also can be just common. Someone dies, at 99 years old, they lived a wonderful life. You're going to have grief and loss, but that's not a traumatic death. That's a very natural course of things. But then someone loses a baby that's, 1 month old and that baby dies. Well, that crosses to me into trauma because that's not a natural course of events. And I think a lot of times trauma, it's not the natural course of events and the grief and loss that result from the natural course of events. It's sort of above and beyond that.
Of course,
that's one distinction I see.
Yeah, of course. So what impacts do you see off the back of this?
I think that, for the work we've done, and a lot of times we do what we call post-adoption counseling. So we see families that come into us with their kids are having trouble. They're having trouble parenting their children as their kids grow. And we work with the family and we start to realize, some of these issues might come back to the fact that family had infertility and didn't work through that infertility piece. And I think it can manifest in a lot of different ways. Sometimes we see resentment towards the child's birth parent. So there's the birth parent that, the couple that's adopting has been trying for, years to conceive a child naturally. And here's this birth parent that accidentally got pregnant on a one-night stand after being at a bar. And there's resentment there. And that resentment can carry over into the way they talk to their child about their birth parent. So you've got this child that their birth parent is important to them. For most adopted children, knowing that genetic history, that's an important person to that child. And if as an adoptive parent, that resentment shines through in the language you're using in talking to your child about your birth parent, that's going to foster a less healthy dynamic and relationship in the adoption. Yeah, that's one thing we see. And then we also see, how kids push buttons no matter what they do. So, kids will say, a kid can throw anything back at you. They learn to push your buttons. And so they might throw back at you and say, my rinse, in a moment of anger, because that's what kids do. They push buttons. But if that parent still has triggers from their infertility, they're not going to handle that. They're not going to handle that in the constructive way. You need to handle I'm really sorry you're upset with me because I'm not letting you go to my friend's house. My answer stands, or however you would calmly respond to that child. They're going to have a trauma trigger and they're going to be extremely reactive because that was a huge button for them. So that's another thing we see happen as well.
Okay. So you're talking really about the kind of the interpersonal, you're talking about self-regulation within the birth mom,
Yes.
birth mum, and their ability, self-regulation, self-awareness, and how that translates into the interpersonal relationships, and the communication that she has with others. Do you ever say anything? Do you ever say anything? Perhaps that's not a good question. What about the dad? What about the dads? I mean, how does it affect them?
I mean, we see similar sometimes. And I think also another way to look at it is you kind of, when you're going through infertility, you have to realize you're not going, and you move to adoption, you have to realize you're not going to have the fantasy child you thought you were going to have. So that fantasy child shares your genes, shares your looks, is a certain way you might imagine it as you're trying to get pregnant. And that's the couple as a whole, not just the woman. And then they have this adoptive child come into the family, and the adoptive child's a little different than this fantasy. He doesn't look like dad. He looks like his birth father. He doesn't like sports like dad. He likes music like his birth father. He may have learning disabilities, or she may have learning disabilities, and not be that fantasy child. And I think both mom and dad struggle sometimes with that piece. And if you don't work through the fact that, okay, I had infertility, I had these losses, I really just want to be a parent, and I want to be a parent through adoption, and I know that brings different challenges, then you kind of have resentment sometimes towards your child, towards your birth parent, for that child not being that quote unquote fantasy child.
Yeah. And I mean, you've used this word fantasy child. I'd say, for me, it's even like the child that it's not, maybe not even fantasy. It may be the child that, I've always wanted to have a kid. So it's nothing to do with, it's not fantasy child on a pedestal. It's just like, I'm always going to have kids. I've always, since an early age, I've wanted to have kids, and I want to have my own kids. It's not fancy. It's just like, I'm not a religious person, but kind of like what I want and my kind of like God-given right. And, this is just normal. It's normal. And I'm expecting my child to look like me and, feel that instant bond. That bond stuff. So how does that play out?
And it does affect the attachment, and it affects what we call, especially entitlement, which is your feeling like you're meant to be a parent. And sometimes families that go through infertility don't feel entitled to be a parent because of what you just said, Simon, because they didn't follow the natural path that you go through to be a parent. They sometimes don't feel entitled to parent that child. And if they don't feel like I have a right to be a child's parent, they also don't always feel like they can attach to that child in the same way. And I think the more infertility you've gone through, the more struggles a family sometimes has with that feeling entitled to be that child's parent when that child isn't a biological child.
Yeah. So yeah, at the heart of what you're talking about here is, I think, two things: therapy and support from people that are in the same position. Yeah. So given that we're just two people having a conversation about this, this isn't a therapy session where you're the therapist and I'm the adoptive dad who can't have kids and still struggling through. So there's clearly limits to what we can share here in terms of the depth of connection and, you know, the questions and answers and the deep dive of therapy. So we can't do that on a Zoom call for a podcast. So what can you share to help adoptive parents listening who feel like maybe they've still got some of this infertility stuff playing for them, and it's getting in the way of relationship with their kids or between themselves even, you know? Like I can,
Right.
when I see stuff on telly about, you know, there was a British show a while ago, can't remember what's going on, but, you know, the guy had a t-shirt on that said "My sperm counts." So, you know, sometimes there can be a bit of friction, as shown on
Yes.
television. There can be some friction between the couples around this infertility. So, that all being said, what can you share on a podcast, given that we can't? This isn't a therapy session.
Couple of things. Well, first of all, you know, I'm a huge advocate for, like you mentioned, seeking help, seeking therapy over this, whether that is, you know, a support group, a buddy program. Post-adoption services are wonderful to address these types of issues. And that's what we do when your agency offers strong post-adoption services. We delve into, like, not just, you know, like fix my child or what's wrong with my child. Well, let's look at the family as a whole. And, you know, maybe there's some factors in you and your parenting that might be impacting that child's behaviors. And so, you know, post-adoption services are really helpful for unpacking this in a family that already has a child and might be thinking that this could be a concern. But ultimately, I mean, I think that kind of the tasks that families need to do is kind of recognize that they have been through a lot with infertility. They have had losses, grieve those losses, grieve the fact that, you know, you didn't have a biological child. You didn't bring a child into your family in that conventional way you thought you always were going to. There's nothing wrong with grieving that and feeling that, but grieve it and then figure out how to make the switch to, okay, we don't have that biological child, but we're parents. You know, we're parents to an awesome child that may not look like we thought he, she, they might look, but we're parents to this great child. And so making that switch and then realizing that it doesn't go away. The grief and loss of infertility doesn't go away. You know, if you had a miscarriage, if you had a stillbirth, you know, you have embryos that didn't work, those losses don't go away. Parents remember those on anniversaries of those events happening. But then you realize, okay, it's coming up to that anniversary. That's a hard day for me. You know, how can I be aware of my triggers? What can I do to work through the grief I'm still experiencing so it doesn't spill out onto my child and my relationship with my child? And then I think just in general too, mental health checks. So you mentioned, Simon, and I'll tell you statistically that, you know, infertility comes out as one of the primary reasons for divorce among couples, not just initially, but later on too. It's a huge area of discord that researchers tap into as a reason for divorce. And also a lot of women with infertility have a really high rate of anxiety and depression that they don't get treated because they just think, well, I was going through infertility. It was a hard time, but then it never goes away. So kind of doing self-check, like, are you depressed? Are you anxious? You can be a great parent and still have those things going on that you might need to recognize and seek help for.
Yeah. So do you see a lot of people bottling it up?
Yes. I think what happens is that, you know, once you get a child, you think it's going to go away. Like, I think a lot of couples think that as long as I get a child, I'll be happy. That's all I need. But it doesn't go away because if you don't work through any of the stuff that happened to you, it comes out at some other point in life in a different way.
Right. So we're really talking about taking the lid off the bottle. We're talking about bringing this stuff up in out into the open. And I guess that's, that is, whether that's in with a therapist or whether that's with a support group, then that's what we're doing. We're normalizing it. So we're normalizing it. So it's not, I guess it's not that, well, it's not, I'm back to that murder in the dark thing. It's not that bogeyman that's waiting to jump out at you, or
Right.
or bogey woman that's constantly on your shoulder, whispering into your ear, look, you're not a good mum, you should have had a child, you should have your own child. That kind of lingering horrible stuff. I mean, I'm just making this up, but
no, you're spot on. And I think normalizing it is so important, because if you normalize it, you have a lot, like couples that feel this way have a lot of guilt also, because here you are, you're parenting this adopted child, you're still having some issues related to your past infertility. Well, there's a lot of guilt there. Like I want to be a good parent, and I feel like I'm not a good parent because I have all this other stuff. I'm still sad that I didn't have a biological child. Well, normalizing that, like, those things can coexist. You can still have feelings about the infertility and be a wonderful parent to the child that you adopted. You just have to figure out how to do that.
Yeah. And it's because that's the perennial question, isn't it, for everything, is how.
Right.
And everybody's kind of, whatever aspect of life is, how do we do that? And then comes the frustration when we can't find an answer, when we try every different avenue. So I guess this kind of spill over. You talked about guilt. I guess it spill over into frustration as well, and maybe spiraling.
And sometimes people don't even have the insight to know that it connects back to infertility. They just know they're struggling with their adopted child. They're struggling as parents, and they don't always know why they're struggling. So, this isn't talked about all the time. No one wants to put out there this, oh my gosh, I'm still a parent, but I'm having these thoughts. I think that, making sure that you go to a good therapist that can maybe bring that out of you. It may not be something you're even aware of how it connects necessarily until you seek help.
Yeah. So I can see many things in my own life that nothing to do with infertility, that have gone down the same emotional road. It's that guilt and shame stuff. Have you ever? I reference this book a lot in the podcast. It's called Power versus Force by a guy called David Hawkins. Have you come across that?
I don't know that. No, I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, he's got he's developed he's unfortunately no longer with us. He developed a scale of human consciousness. So it's nice and scientific because it's a scale, but really it's about, it's about emotions. So it goes from 0 to 1,000, and shame is and guilt is 20. 0 is dead. Below 200 is life detracting, and above 200 is life affirming. Unconditional love is, I think, 350, 500. Pride, like egoic pride, is 180. He calibrates the wagging of a dog's tail, right? The unconditional love of a dog's tail. So it's a fascinating area, but the reason I often bring it up is because that shame thing, shame and guilt, down at 20, is, I think it's kind of, what's the word? It's underestimated in society. It's like, it's the stuff we are ashamed of, and that's why Brene Brown does such great stuff on vulnerability, because we dare to share what we're really ashamed of. And when we're, and I guess that's what goes on in the groups, they dare to share what they're really ashamed of. And I'm thinking of like the cop shows I watch. There's always somebody that's whether it's the UK or the US, increasingly in the UK, there's a show running at the moment, and one of the coppers that is in AA, and it's that group. Get the stuff off your chest. Share the stuff with strangers that you wouldn't even dare to share with your friends, because your friends are going to try and talk you up. So if you say, I'm just picking this out of the air, right? The mum that struggled with infertility adopts. She goes to her best friend saying she's got a problem, and the answer comes back, and the answer's really kind and considerate and empathetic, but there's a slight bit in there which says, which the sensitive adoptive mum who's been through infertility issues reads as, I should be okay now because I've got the child that I wanted. And then that kicks off. That just makes it worse, and then you fall out with the friend because she's been, quote unquote, insensitive to you. So all we're doing really here is bringing the conversation. It isn't therapy, it isn't group support, but we're bringing this out into the open. So hopefully it's lost the bogeyman that is infertility trauma is less scary.
I think that's important to bring it out in the open. I think that it affects so many people, and that's people whether they adopt or not. And obviously this dialogue is more connected to adoption, but when I run my infertility groups, so much of what is talked about is the impact of infertility on their lives. And a lot of the people in our groups are just, going through the process, thinking about adoption, but thinking about other choices as well. If some of this work can be done even before you choose to adopt, that's kind of the healthiest scenario, not always going to happen. And then sometimes you realize it after, at any time you realize it is good. But yeah, having it out in the open, and it's not, not having it be a shameful thing, that it's other people go through this, other people have the same thoughts, the same feelings. The groups really help you normalize that. And someone that hasn't been through it doesn't understand it. So then people do make comments to you like, well, why are you still feeling this way? We've got a child now. Even spouses, right? Like one spouse might say to the other, like, I don't understand why you're still upset about this. We've got a great kid. Like going to a forum where you can maybe talk to others and see that this is normal and okay to talk about. And I think important for society to talk about too, because I think nothing will change drastically if it's still a secretive thing in society, that infertility has this huge impact on us. And so many people statistically experience infertility in general. And so many people that experience infertility adopt. So I think it's a really relevant topic for us to be discussing and to have out there.
Yeah. So what other than bringing it out, into the open as we've done, what else can you share with the listeners for whom they may feel that this is an issue?
So I think that, if we're talking about bringing it out here in this forum, right? But if people are comfortable bringing it out to others, that can help too, to your family, to your friends. Let others know, hey, this is what I went through and it was really hard, as opposed to kind of keeping it as this internal secret thing. And I think that helps to normalize really anything hard that you've been through, right? Being able to say, I went through this thing and this thing was really tough. I think that as hard as that is, there's healing in that. Even if you choose, and sometimes I tell couples that are going through infertility that don't want to tell their family or friends, choose one safe person. Tell that one safe person, here's what I'm going through. Start small. But I think that, talking about it is healthy.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I've seen people do is unrelated, as just like people talk about online, and it's not something I do, but journaling. Do people journal in this stuff? Does that help to get it out?
Yeah, journaling's super therapeutic. Art, journaling, if you're into art, drawing your feelings on it. And there are a lot of books. There's a lot of like different books and media out there on infertility journeys that people can follow other people's stories or follow professionals that have written about this. That helps too.
Yeah. I'm going to take a bit of a curveball here, right? Because one of my takes on this is that we're not our trauma, right? You know, people say that our trauma is part of us. Well, it's not kind of like it's part of us. Well, it's like it's a bruise on our body, or, you know, like people talk about a primal wound, right, in adoption. And a trauma is us, or you know, it's a part of our, well, but you know, it's part of us. Well, it's not really. It doesn't seem to be to me. It's part of our story, yeah, but we're not our story, are we? We are not our trauma. I read something about an addict actually who struggled for years until he saw that he was bigger than his addiction. He was, and to me, that's the fact that, you know, we're bigger than our trauma. The trauma is some feelings, but it's like, but we're not our feelings, right? Does this make any sense to you?
It does, I think. You know, I think that's where getting help comes into place, right? So if you don't, for many people, if you don't address the trauma, it does become who you are. But if you get the right help and support, you transcend that. It's not who you are, and that's the goal, right?
Yeah. My feelings on this are a bit way out, really. You know, I think I'm trying. It's, for me, it's like some of the only way to kind of express these abstract concepts for me is through metaphor. So the fact that, you know, we're the, I think this is a Buddhist one, you know, and I'm not a Buddhist, but, you know, we're the sky, and the trauma is the cloud, and we become fixated on the cloud rather than softening our view and seeing the sky behind us. Does that make any?
I mean, I like the sky analogy, because also going back to what you had mentioned earlier when we were talking, like, you can have sunny days, right, where those clouds aren't even anywhere in sight whatsoever. That could go on for years, and then all of a sudden a cloud comes into view. Yeah. And that trauma's little piece of it's there, but I mean, you could have those sunny skies for a long time.
Yeah. The other way I've heard about saying this, I say this a fair bit on the podcast, is this French philosopher guy who says, you know, we're not human beings having a spiritual experience, we're spiritual beings having a human experience. So that spirit bit with the spiritual beings having the human experience, all the trauma is in the human experience, and life is a contact sport. Stuff happens, you know, like infertility happens, and like adoption happens, or relinquishment. So in my case, relinquishment. So relinquishment happens, and you've got the difference between, you've got the relinquishment, and then you've got the adoption. But most of the pain as well, everybody focuses on the adoption, apart from Nancy Verrier, who talks about the primal wound of relinquishment, right? So, but even that is all in the kind of the contact sport that is life, and that's in the human experience bit, and that's the bit that it's really loud, and it's traumatic, and it grabs our attention, and we get hooked into it. Meanwhile, we kind of lose sight of the fact that we're the spiritual being having that experience, and we get lost in our experience. And I was watching a program the other day, and it had some like black magic stuff, and because I'm into this show, I'm drawn into the black magic. But if I wasn't if I wasn't into black magic, if I wasn't into the show, I would have just seen the first episode of the show and say the black magic. I say that's rubbish, but we're kind of like, we're drawn into the trauma story. We're drawn into the contact sport that is life, and we're less focused on that spiritual being that can't be wounded. Is this making any sense to you? Am I making any sense?
It does a little bit. And I think that one of the things to keep in mind too, I mean, on a more kind of optimistic end is like, you know, trauma is interesting and human experience is interesting because people develop a lot of resilience in our lives, right? So you can go through all this with infertility or any other thing that for you is traumatic, and you can come out on top, and it's not the impact on some of these things that I'm describing. You know, we see many families that successfully navigate their infertility and have resiliency and make that mental switch from wanting to be pregnant to wanting to parent a child and do all of that successfully, and don't have those, you know, ongoing triggers, lifelong concerns. But if you look at it in the context of trauma, you've got that for some people, it has more of an impact. For others, they develop coping skills differently. They have different levels of resiliency and you know, really successfully do navigate this.
Yeah. So what's the difference? Makes the difference then?
Resiliency is a fascinating concept because researchers really don't know exactly what it is, but there's internal characteristics. So there's even things like, I believe gender plays a part, although I'm not 100% sure on that, but there's different factors that make up resiliency. Some of it is relationships with other people. Some of it is past trauma. So if you are a really healthy person going into the infertility, likelihood of you having the skills to come out of it with a little more success is going to be different than someone that has infertility that also was a child of the foster care system, right? Has prior trauma, then has more losses through infertility. So, you know, I think there's a lot of things that factor into also our ability to have coping skills. Some people have been in therapy, had parents that taught them how to cope with anxiety and depression and stress. They naturally implement those coping skills better. Others have to learn that in adulthood that didn't have, you know, families that taught them that growing up. So I think there's a lot of different components that make one person more resilient to the same thing that it brings another person down. And that's in infertility or anything else.
Yeah. I'm fascinated by the resilience area, and my view is completely countercultural and completely opposite to yours. I think you're viewing. You talk about coping strategies, and you're talking about resilience as a skill. Is that how you see it? It's a skill.
I think there's a component of it. I think there's biological factors too, though, that make some people more resilient than others. So I think it's kind of all, my thought of it is it's a lot of different things.
Okay. I mean, I see it really, as I say, my views on it is pretty countercultural. So I don't see it as biological. I don't see it as a skill, because I see it as that, you know, that spirit of who we truly are, that is essentially resilient. So it's like that is, and because we are spirit, we can't be wounded. So for me, we are fundamentally unwoundable. Who we are, you can cut me. If I had a knife, I could cut my arm and I would have a wound, but I'm not my body, so I'm not my biology, right? And that's not who I am. Our body changes all the time. The essential nature of who we are, that spirit, that ghost in the machine thing, is unwoundable because it's not a thing. It's not a thing that can be cut, and is kind of like essentially resilient because it just goes on. You know, it goes on after we've died. Even, you know, that spirit is kind of eternal stuff. So, and from a more practical view, that's perhaps a little bit woo-woo, a little less woo-woo. You know, the child that falls over doesn't think that they've got you know, the child that fails at something doesn't think they've got a problem, isn't worried about being frail. Isn't worried about what people think of him, doesn't worry about what him will think of her. So I think that we kind of if the opposite of resilience is frailty, I think that we learn frailty. And what doesn't kill us makes us stronger, not because it strengthens our muscles, but because it reveals how strong we always were. We just didn't know. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear the way that you look at it. And I can get what you're saying with the more spiritual component of things also.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not a religious guy, but some people who are, they'll find that faith, that they get the strength from that faith in God or their religion. But this is supposed to be, I'm yabbering too much, as I often do. It's just that you happen to get me on the resilience. Well, you've raised the resilience thing, so I've got it's an opportunity to go my stuff. I'm just conscious of time, Erika. What would you like to close with? What's the question that I've not asked about the impact of infertility?
No, I think we covered broadly a whole lot of different things. I mean, I think that, the summary point is that, infertility has a huge impact on raising an adopted child. And it's important to realize that. And we touched on the trauma and the trauma triggers, but there's a couple other little points too. Parents that have had infertility that came with a lot of losses sometimes hold on a little bit tight to their adopted child because they can't bear the loss of losing that child again. So realizing that connection, oh, maybe I'm holding this child a little too tight because I fear losing that child, can affect your parenting. And even something like financial stress. Parents that went through infertility and then they're adopting put themselves very, very, very deep in a hole financially at times. And so that financial stress can affect how your child's experience of the world is. And so just realizing that there really is a broad view of how infertility impacts your experience in parenting a child you adopt.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. So we've gone from the impact on the mom, to the impact on the partner, to the impact on the kid, and then we brought in these financial considerations as well. It's that we're back to that start thing again, that roller coaster, and how kind of it was probably for my mum and dad, it was probably pretty cut and dried, and you don't get those false dawns. You don't get those false dawns. I remember doing a mountain hike when I was a kid, and we kept on. I was really tired, right? I was going to use another word, but it's a family show. And I was climbing this mountain. I said to the leader, the scouting leader, afterwards, can't we just walk along? Can't we just walk along the side of riverbanks? This is really nice, this bit. Why do we have to go up these mountains? So we're going over this mountain, and you keep on thinking you're getting to the summit, and then you get to it's a false summit, and then you all right, I've got to keep on going, and that must be, well, the word is interminable, isn't it? And I'm just thinking back to the first podcast I did was with an adoptive dad called Spencer, and he talks about his infertility journey, his family's infertility journey, and I think they had something like 11, and then they had 11 failed placements or something like that. Foster.
Right.
So it can kind of that was and then there's some cancer as well, some cancer treatment, and yeah, stuff can be really tough.
The adoption journey is as much of a roller coaster as the infertility journey is. And that's why when we work with families, we like them to sort of end the infertility medicalized journey before they begin the adoption journey. Because like you mentioned, there's failed placements, and even in, situations that, domestic infant adoption that might be a little bit legally safer, depending on how the agency you work with and how they conduct their business. But even in those situations, you have, you may be matched with a birth mother who changes her mind before, the baby is here, or you might meet a baby in the hospital and the birth mother changes her mind and can't go through with it on the day of discharge. So there are roller coasters and ups and downs with that too. And then the other thing, using your analogies that you've mentioned, but if you're on a roller coaster, whether that's infertility or that's adoption journey, sometimes you get off a roller coaster and you feel like you're still on it. Your body feels like you're still on it. And the same thing happens with these journeys. Like all of a sudden you've got a child in your home, a baby or a child in your home. You don't automatically feel like you're off that roller coaster. Like that continues.
Yeah. We've got this cultural thing, haven't we? I'll be happy when.
Yes.
I'll be happy when. And it just keeps playing. Thank you very much, Erika. This has been fascinating. And just before we sign off, just popped into my head, I'm going to put a link to Spencer's episode in the show notes. So if you want, what Erika and I have been talking about is theory, I guess, very informed theory and some little examples. If you want to dive into this, and the failed placements were to do with birth mothers changing their mind as well, I think, with Spencer. So I'm going to put a link back into the show notes here. So if you want to hear one, and interesting, it was a guy story, on this, then check that out. So Erika, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope I haven't talked too much.
No, you're great. It's been great talking to you. I think this was a really interesting topic to jump into with you. Yeah,
you're a star. Thanks a lot for your time, and see you soon.
Thank you for having us.
Listeners. Cheers. Bye-bye.